This is information that you really need to know. And the system is changing, and it's never changed more quickly than it has in the last 5 years. I have been kind of at the tip of the spear as far as changing the fire insurance grading index from what it was, which was an old manual that looked like a Yellow Pages book, into what it is, which is a completely digital GIS database, which allows every insurer in Canada to type in an address or a lat long and to get a very exact level of fire protection, which they can then use to determine what is the appropriate premium to charge for property insurance. So I'll go through the whole presentation and kind of connect all the dots for you guys. At the very end, I'll discuss the positive feedback loop, but in the back of your heads, all the way through the presentation, realize that's where we're going with this, is that the entire system of Canadian fire insurance grading, it's set up as a positive feedback loop, and it works. It actually is the reason that we have very good levels of fire protection across the country and very low levels of fire losses across the country, and why that has really changed over the last 100 years. So going back to the history and origins, the original fire insurance grading index was set up in 1883. And why? It was the same story in the United States, just so you know. We pretty much followed in their footsteps, although in the last 30 years we've kind of diverged and gone in different directions. But way back when it started in the 1800s, fires would hit communities and they would devastate them. When a fire hit a community, sometimes it would wipe out as much as 50%, 70%, 80%. In 1905, when the Great Fire of San Francisco hit, it wiped out 95% of the buildings, one fire. So that was devastating to the community. You can imagine economically trying to rebuild a community after a 95% property loss. It was literally devastating, and not just to the property owners and to the municipal authorities who were trying to build a city, but it was devastating to the insurance industry as well. And when these kinds of events would occur, oftentimes insurers would actually go insolvent. They would go bankrupt. People that were insured would find out, well, they're only going to get 10 cents on the dollar of what they were insured for. And why was this? It's because the insurers weren't charging enough premium for the level of risk that they actually were carrying as far as insuring in these communities. That was part of the problem. And then the other part of the problem was the insurers didn't really understand what level of risk was in the communities. And the last part of the problem was the insurers' capitalist nature was causing them to kind of always undercut each other. So any of you guys who have ever dealt with insurers, you know you can probably get them competing for your business. This has always been the case with the insurance industry, and sometimes it can actually undermine their financial stability. Because essentially you get two insurers, Aviva and Intact, competing for your business, and Intact wants to write your business for $1,000 a year, so Aviva says, well, we'll write it for $950. Once Intact finds that out, they'll say, well, we'll undercut them and we'll do it for $925. And at a certain point, they're actually cutting their premiums down so low that when a big loss happens, they don't have enough money put away to cover the losses. And that essentially was something that was happening over and over again, and to such a severe extent that the insurers all came together and said, we've got to find a way to put a stop to that. And the solution that they came up with was this. It was the Fire Insurance Grading Index, which essentially all the insurers came together in one room, and these are guys that were normally at each other's throats. These guys were competing for business. They were not friends. So they all came together in the same room, and they agreed to a set of terms. And they said, you know what, let's have one group of engineers represent us all. Let's have them create a standardized measure of fire protection in every community in our country, publish that information, and we'll all agree to, they called it a tariff system, to set tariffs that essentially would put all of the insurance policies for property into these brackets of insurance, which we know now insurers refer to as protected, semi-protected, unprotected. Back in the day, they had different terms for them, but just be aware that essentially all the insurers came to an agreement in 1883 and formed an association, basically to say, we want to play by the same rules. Part of that was controlling line capacities. And in the insurance game, people use this term line capacity. You can think of it if you were betting. You might want to limit your risk in terms of how many bets you want to place of a certain type. And it's the same for insurers. They might want to control their risk by grouping the risks into lines. One of the things that my group did, and this is starting back right around 1900, was to create these fire insurance plans. So for every community or every major municipality in Canada, about every 10 to 30 years, we would review the community, have a team of actual land surveyors go through and draw these maps. So you can actually access these maps in any major university's archives in Canada. They'll be in the section that's controlled by copyright. You're not allowed to take pictures and what have you. We actually have a separate group that we call the Historic Environmental Insurance Rate System. We call it short for short ERRS. These maps are available for all communities across Canada. And originally they were used specifically to help insurers control their line capacities. So essentially, if you were an insurer working out of Ontario, let's say out of Toronto, and you were underwriting in Regina, you'd want to know kind of the makeup of Regina. You'd want to know that you don't have 17 risks on one block, so that if there's a big fire on that block, then you get wiped out. So essentially, we would create these maps that showed the construction type and a bunch of the details of fire protection for every community across the country. And we did this on an ongoing basis, and we continue to do it. Although the environmental, the use of the maps is now more for environmental than it is for fire rating, because now we've digitized all the fire rating stuff. In Canada, we have two lines of insurance: commercial lines, personal lines. Basically, personal is that property which is owned for personal use. And in terms of the insurance community, it's typically defined as dwellings. It also includes duplexes, but typically nothing bigger than that. Just be aware that as you're building up your community, we're measuring your fire protection in two ways, one for each of these lines of insurance. That's something that we're considering changing, and it may actually change in the next few years. But as it stands right now, and certainly as it stood for the last few decades, just be aware that there are two lines of insurance, and you're going to be measured against both of them. The commercial line of insurance we measure on the PFBC scale, Public Fire Protection Class. You get a 1 to 10 class. Every community in Canada has one. Hopefully you know yours. If you don't, after today, you can inquire about it and find out what is your PFBC class, because we've already assigned it. We've evaluated every community, and we've assigned these classes. The personal line system for dwellings, we assign a separate grade called the Dwelling Protection Grade, and this impacts the property insurance for dwellings. We know that a number of insurers have been using that grade improperly for buildings that it was never intended to be used for, and that's something that it's created a bit of a stir in the industry, and we may actually completely eliminate the dwelling protection grade system at some point in the future. But be aware, for those of you involved in any kind of fire protection in your community, you should know your dwelling protection grade, because it has an enormous impact on the insurance rates in your community, because it affects every dwelling, and typically most communities are made up primarily of dwellings. What's the difference in the two systems? Well, the commercial line system is a very rigorous measurement, and essentially what we're measuring there is your ability to protect large-scale fires. And the biggest difference in this system is that we look at every community differently, so that community A isn't measured against the same requirements as community B. Sorry, where did you say you were from, Glenn?
Melfort.
Melfort. So we wouldn't consider the level of fire protection that Glenn maintains in Melfort to be the equivalent or same level of fire protection as Regina. Why not? Fires are fires, buildings are buildings, wood is wood, things burn. Well, essentially, the amount of fire risk that Glenn has in his community is very different than what we would see in Regina. The number of buildings, the concentration of buildings, the separation between buildings, the way the community has developed, the number of fires that occur annually, all these things are very different in those two communities, so we measure them differently. And that's one of the key differences between the two systems. In the PFBC system, we measure the risk specific to that community, unlike the DPG system. The DPG system, we measure the risk in a very consistent, homogeneous way. Everybody on the DPG system, every community in Canada, is measured against their ability to protect what we call the typical dwelling. So another problem with that system is that the typical dwelling that we designed the system for in the 50s and 60s is no longer the same as the typical dwelling of today. And essentially, buildings have gotten bigger. Communities have started building the buildings closer together. There's been a lot of things that have changed how an appropriate fire department response would occur for a dwelling than it would have, 50 or 60 years ago. Each fire insurance grade is made up of 4 key measurements: fire department, water supplies, fire safety control, and emergency communications. Fire department counts for 40%. Essentially, that's your ability to have enough apparatus, have enough firefighters, have them positioned in the community relative to the risk so they can get there in the appropriate time frame to be effective. And what we call effective in terms of property insurance is to actually fight fires offensively and save buildings, not defensively and let buildings burn down. In terms of the water supplies, we measure your ability to produce what we call the required fire flows. We publish a document called Water Supply for Public Fire Protection. Every community has access to it. Anybody involved in civil engineering for communities should be aware of it. Whether you have made it a part of your local land use or zoning bylaw, it's entirely up to you. That's one of the most effective ways to make sure that your water supply systems will be up to snuff, is that if you require all of your engineering departments to actually design for fire flows and to make the fire flow calculation from Fire Underwriter survey. Because there are more than one. Just so you know, there's 100 ways to calculate required fire flows. And in terms of how effective the water would be in any of those calculations, you have to consider what is the objective of that method. And I won't get too deep into the weeds for you guys, but just be aware that a sprinkler system is designed to activate when a fire is at its incipient stage. So when a fire just starts burning and the room temperature hits, or the ceiling temperature hits 165 degrees, this is like 2 minutes into a fire, one sprinkler head goes off because it essentially breaks. There's a fusible link that breaks at that temperature. And when that fusible link breaks, about 10 gallons per minute comes out right there. And 10 gallons per minute at 2 minutes into a fire, that's enough. In fact, most fires, 99% of fires, they'll be controlled at the point of origin with one sprinkler head. But if there's no sprinkler head and the building continues to burn and more, the fire expands and expands and expands until it becomes a fully involved structure fire, we could then activate one sprinkler head and it wouldn't do anything. It wouldn't be effective at all. So what you have to know when you're considering which fire flow methodology is right for your community, what is the design objective? Do you want enough water to be there 2 minutes into the fire, or enough water to be there at a fully involved structure fire? Our system is specifically for fully involved structure fires. So just be aware that engineers, when we implement this system for required fire flow calculations, engineers will often push back. And it's appropriate that they do so. As engineers will tell you, well, if you want to have that big of pipes, it's going to cost more. We're going to need bigger pumps. We're going to need bigger reservoirs. We're going to need more chlorine or whatever treatment system that we're using. And so it's all going to cost a bit more. But in terms of protecting buildings from fire, that's how much water that we've calculated that you need. And we have quite a bit of experience in this. I just want to quickly mention fire safety control because it's something that, we'll go into it in a bit more depth, but just be aware that we're measuring how well communities implement and enforce things like building codes, fire codes, and have they gone above and beyond. In fact, I've been working with the province of BC, one of the ministries, to help communities to get the authorization to have sprinkler bylaws that exceed the building code. Some communities that have very limited fire protection resources, maybe it's appropriate that they have complete sprinkler protection for every building. So these are the kind of things that we're measuring when we're measuring the fire safety control. And you might think these things would be very standardized, but our experience has been that they're not. When we measure how well Community A, Regina, implements the building code and what sort of budget they have for enforcement, it's quite different than Community B, Saskatoon. We see huge differences across the board. And why? Because it's not regulated. Provinces and the federal authorities have not deemed it appropriate to tell you, the communities that are running these, making these decisions, how many plan reviewers do you need in your community? How frequently do you need to be doing building code inspections and fire code inspections for a permit process? You decide those things for yourselves, and just be aware that when you're making those decisions, we're going to come through after the fact and make a measurement of those, and it will impact your fire insurance rates. As I was saying, the first step when we do the fire insurance grading is to measure fire risk, and we do that in terms of required fire flows. There's a new thing in some parts of Canada that we've seen, 6-story combustible. I don't know if you guys have started to see it in Saskatchewan yet, or if it's been allowed. I'm guessing probably not, but being that it's been around now for more than 5 years in BC, it's been picked up in Ontario, you can expect that it'll be on your radar sooner than later. So be aware, 6-story combustible, it's coming down the pipe. If developers start saying in your community, we want to build 36 6-story combustibles down in this new subdivision, what is your policy on that? How well is your fire department set up to fight fires in 6-story combustible? How well is your water system infrastructure set up to deliver the required fire flows that are necessary for that? And are those questions being asked when you guys are setting up these kinds of occupancies? Be aware, this is what we do. If you ever want any kind of advice on those kinds of things, feel free to give us a call. We can help you with any of it, the calculation of the required fire flows, the determination of what is an appropriate level of response for your community. And we often do that kind of thing. We'll even come into communities and say, you know what, this particular subdivision is something where you should be charging the developer up front and saying, you need to, as a developer, provide $2 million for a new piece of aerial equipment because we don't have that piece of equipment and we'll need it to protect this kind of occupancy. When we do our risk assessments, essentially we go through it at 3 levels: the building level, zone level, and the community level. And at the building level, we calculate the required fire flows. For this building, considering how big it is, what it's built with, how well it's protected with automatic sprinkler protection, we might calculate the required fire flows for this building to be 2,000 gallons per minute. If you think in the old school ways, you might think of that as being 10 hose streams, because each hose stream is about 200 gallons per minute. So to fight a fully involved structure fire in this building, we need about 10 hose streams. Each piece of fire apparatus usually can deliver about 2, so we need about 5 pieces of fire apparatus to deliver that. Give or take. There's some pieces of equipment that might be able to deliver more. But if you were designing this community, would you be asking those questions? Those are the right questions to be asking. Do we have that amount of equipment? Can we deliver it in the appropriate time frame? Do we have the right infrastructure for this type of risk? We certainly ask those kinds of questions, and when we're calculating your fire insurance grade, we can make that kind of information available to you. So, as I said, be aware that required fire flows are the core measurement of risk when we calculate fire insurance grades. And in terms of your engineering department, you should know that term, required fire flows. It's essentially going to be the most governing requirement for your water supply system. I mean, when we compare your domestic demand for everybody to flush the toilets and have showers to fire flow, it's probably about a 9-to-1 or a 10-to-1 ratio. So when you're designing your water supply infrastructure and how big does your reservoir need to be, how big do your pipes need to be, how big do your pumps need to be, you need to know that term, fire flow, and know that it comes basically in two categories. Required fire flow, that's what we calculate that you're probably going to need for a fully involved structure fire, and available fire flow. And that's what we're going to measure at the hydrant. So when we actually come in and measure a community and how effectively you're going to be able to control fires, we're going to open up hydrants. We're going to open up your water supply infrastructure. We'll do a detailed digital analysis, but we'll actually get in hands-on and open up your hydrants and measure exactly how much water can you produce around these buildings that you've allowed to be built. We map all this in as points. So each required fire flow, typically we don't do a required fire flow for every building, but we try to do one for every block, or at least every subdivision. If the fire flow is very homogeneous in an area, like let's say all single family residences, all dwellings, then we might just assign one required fire flow to that area. And that one point would represent that area. But typically in like a downtown area like this, we would calculate the required fire flows, and you can see on this slide, each one of those little flame icons represents a required fire flow, and that's typically how we would do it. It helps us in our digital analysis of how effective your fire protection system is, because essentially once we have all of these points put into our GIS system, we can use each one of those points. You can think of it like a gravitational field. Each one of those points, the higher the required fire flow. Let's say if we had 5 of those 6-story combustible buildings in one of these points, that required fire flow might be 7,000 or 8,000 gallons per minute. So essentially that creates a lot of gravitational pull for resources. To effectively fight a fire in a location like that, you might need 20 pieces of apparatus and 100 firefighters. So when we're measuring how effective your firefighting system is, that's what we're measuring it against. And if you don't have that number of firefighters or that number of apparatus or pipes that are big enough to handle that, it's okay. It's not the end of the world. We just measure it accordingly. You can think of our system of measurement a lot like the financial rating systems, Standards & Poor's, Equifax. All of us have credit ratings. All of your communities, I'm sure, have credit ratings. Someone externally is measuring you on a bunch of variables of how indebted you are, how many assets that you have, and they're determining how credit worthy they think your personal or your government is. And once they determine that, they assign a rating to it, and banks and lenders use that rating to then say, we think that you can pay back this much, therefore we're going to assign you this level of credit. We'll give you this percentage of, whatever the interest rates happen to be. So just like the way the financial institutions do it, the insurance community does it as well. But instead of being interested in how indebted you are and how many assets you have, we're interested in how much fire risk have you built in your community and how well have you set up your community to protect that fire risk. Typically, we group those points into zones to make it a little bit simpler for especially you, the communities, to understand, because it can be difficult when you're looking at a lot of points, especially when you get into larger communities where you get thousands and thousands or tens of thousands of points. It can be hard to kind of grasp it all. So we'll group those fire flows into zones, what we call fire flow demand zones, and then we can use that zone to measure the effectiveness of fire response across the zone in general. And we found that most required fire flows in that zone are plus or minus 15% from what we've assigned as the fire flow demand. So essentially in this area, you can see in the red area of this community, they might have a required fire flow for that zone of 5,000 gallons per minute, whereas in the outskirts, in the yellow zones, it might be down to 1,000 gallons per minute. Once we've measured the risk, then we can measure the response effectiveness. And essentially, most communities, they aren't aware necessarily that this is the process that the fire protection should be set up with. Hopefully, fire chiefs are becoming aware of this, but I can tell you, I've been in the business for 16 years, and I can tell you most communities don't know about this process and largely go into their fire protection decisions based on rhetoric. So a fire chief or some representative of the fire department or even the manager of the community will just say, listen, we're terrified that buildings are getting too big, we need bigger equipment, we need another fire station, response times are getting too long. But they're not necessarily quantifying it. And it's fine. I mean, people did the best they could with what they had. But I think nowadays in the digital world and with the system that we've created, it's a lot easier for people to get their head around how to make these decisions on more quantifiable terms, as opposed to just saying, generally we think that our response is ineffective in that area, so we're going to build a new fire station out there because it seems like a good idea. What we want to say is, more specifically, we've measured the fire responses out there are getting to be over 12 minutes, and we have under 4 firefighters being able to arrive. We consider that to be totally ineffective because we've measured it, and we know that that is an ineffective response. To be more effective, we have to up this or down that. And you can't always change anything. Sometimes you just have to say, this is a risk that we have to accept. And that's fine too. It's absolutely normal for communities as they develop to have more fire risk than they can adequately protect. But if you know that, then your behavior changes. And essentially, if you know, let's say you own a cottage out in the middle of nowhere, and there's no fire department, there's no ambulance, there's nobody coming. If there's a problem, your behavior, your personal risk management, your personal decisions around everything that you do changes. So it's really good to know that essentially you can measure your risk in your community, and you can use that information to determine and choose a level of fire protection that you deem is appropriate, considering your economics and considering the cost benefits that we're going to discuss in a bit. Just before I jump ahead, when we evaluate your fire department response, we look at a lot of different factors. Apparatus is one of them. One of the most heavily weighted is available fire force. And be aware that we give credit for volunteer and auxiliary firefighters, but that credit is changing. Traditional model, dwelling protection grade, to get a qualifying fire department, you needed 15 trained firefighters on your roster. What we found when we set up that system was that with 15 trained firefighters on your roster, we would almost always get a response of 5 firefighters. In the last couple of decades, that's changed, and we've seen that dropping, in particular during certain times of day. And we're not 100% sure on exactly why this is. Maybe employers are less likely to want to participate. So in the old days, everybody participated in the fire department. When the fire alarm went, guys left their workstation and just went to fight the fire. Nowadays, more employers are saying, no, if you leave your place of business, we're not paying you. So volunteer firefighters are just saying, no, I'm not coming out to that call. Plus, more and more people have different kinds of work schedules that might call them out of their place of, or out of their community for long periods of time. People might be out working in the patch for 2 months, then they come home and live for 2 months. So during that 2 months where they're out in the patch, they can't respond to fires. And because of these changes in the way that we live as Canadians, we've seen a diminishment in the effectiveness of volunteer firefighting. And we're making changes to how we measure that to try to account for that. Because right now, in our in our opinion, volunteer fire departments are probably being given too much credit, and insurance rates are lowered in a way that's disproportionate to how effective they are. We're working to try to develop a better system of measuring volunteer fire forces, but be aware as we do that, we're going to start asking more detailed questions like how many of those volunteer firefighters that you have are available, live in the community, and are within 8 kilometers of the fire station they respond to, and work in the community and are available to respond from their place of work, which also needs to be within 8 kilometers of the fire station. And as we start quantifying those things, more fire departments are actually going to be bumped down to unrecognized, unprotected. And that's fine too. It affects insurance rates negatively, and yeah, people's insurance rates go up when that happens, but it sets off an alarm in the community. When people's insurance rates go up, they say, what's wrong? You know, something's got to give here. It sets off an alarm that reminds the citizens in your community that they have a responsibility. If they want to be entitled to those lower insurance rates, they need to take action and be part of their community fire department and their fire protection plan and make sure that that fire protection plan never drops below that minimum requirement. And essentially that's one of the reasons that we're here and talking about this specifically in Saskatchewan. For those of you guys who have made decisions around fire protection, I hope that you're already aware. If you're not, I'm going to quickly explain the 2 most common standards of reference that come up for fire departments, NFPA 1710 and NFPA 1720. Neither one of them are mandated by law. Some communities around, in particular the states, have started to say, you know, we want to incorporate these and mandate, you know, we're going to actually make it part of our legal system. But just be aware, when fire departments talk about these, and you'll see in particular union fire departments will want to talk about NFPA 1710. Understand what that is and what loopholes or sort of gray areas exist. Just like any document, it's a good starting point, but it's not the end-all be-all. NFPA 1710, or I'll start off with 1720, is a set of standards for volunteer fire departments. It doesn't stipulate how big a community needs to be to stop being a volunteer fire department and to become a composite fire department. And it doesn't stipulate, you know, when a community should go on to career. It only says, if you're going to follow NFPA 1720, here are 5 standards of response based on population density. NFPA, for those of you guys who aren't familiar with it, it's a set of consensus standards, mainly around fire protection and emergencies. So when I say it's consensus, what ends up happening is basically anybody can participate in the development of that standard. And typically what happens is when they develop a standard, they'll get a handful of, you know, it's just like our political system, kind of polarized opposites. And they tend to land in the middle. And is that the right answer? Maybe, maybe not. I heard a great CBC article on the fisheries in Atlantic Canada, where some environmentalists were saying it's go ahead and do that kind of fishing. Some said, no, you shouldn't do any of it. They landed in the middle, and they turned out it was wrong. And allowing any of that kind of, you know, scrape the bottom kind of fishing would completely wipe out the fisheries for decades. And they continued to allow it, even though a diminished amount of it, and it was devastating to the fisheries. So NFPA is the same kind of thing. They tend to go from 2 polarized opposites, and they find somewhere in the middle. But I have to say, it's better than nothing. And for a long time in fire departments and fire protection standards, there was nothing. The greatest thing about NFPA is that it does create a set of terms of reference. And if you don't have common terms of reference, you may not even be talking about the same thing. So anytime that you're talking with your fire department, I strongly recommend that you get a hold of one of the 2 NFPA standards, 1720 or 1710, and be aware of the terms of reference. What is a firefighter? Does a firefighter require a certain amount of training? For those of you guys that operate fire departments here, what is the required amount of training that you require of your firefighters before they're allowed to fight fires? If a firefighter dies on his way to fight a fire and has a car accident because he's driving fast, is he covered? Is he actually going, that just happened fairly recently in BC, and it went right to the commissioner's office because it created a big hubbub about, is a volunteer firefighter covered or is he not covered? When do his duties start? Is it from the time his pagers go off, or is it when he actually picks up a hose? And it turned out when they did a big study in BC, they found out that 80% of the fire departments didn't have certified firefighters. And I bet if we did the same study in Saskatchewan, it would be the same here. So what is the level of certification of your firefighters? Do you require them to be NFPA certified, or do you require them to have some other level of certification? And what does that certification entail? So just be aware of these things. They're all laid out in NFPA, and 1720 stipulates standards of response for volunteer fire departments, and they're specific to population density. It can be a little difficult to get your head around at first, but just be aware. We were just talking earlier about cardiac arrest. There was a study that came out about cardiac arrest and how effective response was for high-rise people that had cardiac arrest. Well, fire departments also need to consider standards of response. So how effective is a fire department that responds with 10 firefighters in 10 minutes? That's a common one that hopefully you guys are going to become aware of in the near future as well, because it's going to become part of the National Building Code, and spatial separation requirements of buildings are going to be determined by whether or not your response is 10 minutes with 10 firefighters. So the next question is, how do you determine? Do you have a response of 10 firefighters within 10 minutes? How do you measure that? We have to go back to terms of reference. And again, these are well documented in NFPA 17, the 1710, 1720 series. 1720 in particular is great for most departments that are volunteers because it gives you some indication of benchmarks of what you could be looking at. Should you be aiming for 9 firefighters in 15 minutes, 10 firefighters in 10 minutes, 4 firefighters in 15 minutes? Standards of response are important, and if you don't have a policy within your municipality for this is what the standard of response that we want in our community is, this is what we're delivering, this is what we've measured ourselves as being capable of, you may have some liability exposure there. And when you get into an incident where you're in court, believe me, any subject matter expert is going to be referencing these two standards and saying, well, NFPA 1710 says a career fire department should have 4 career firefighters arriving within 4 minutes, 90% of the time. So career fire departments need to be extremely aware that if they are not adopting NFPA 1710, and I can tell you that I don't know of any fire department in Canada that can achieve that they need to, by policy, specifically say, we are not accepting that standard of response. We know that that standard exists, but we're not using it. We're using a standard of response of 4 firefighters in 7 minutes, or 8 minutes, or 12 minutes. What it is that we can achieve, we understand that that will be less effective. Be aware also of the weaknesses of these documents, that both documents, like the dwelling protection grade system, are specifically measuring fire department's effectiveness for a typical dwelling. What is a typical dwelling? It's a dwelling with not bigger than 2,000 square feet in total area, including all stories, excluding basements. So that's your 1,000 square foot per story, 2-story home. With limited exposures, and by limited exposures, their definition says no other buildings within 30 meters. I don't even know of any buildings that exist except for out in the rural areas that meet that definition. And it says that the AHJ, the authority having jurisdiction, will determine how much better the response needs to be if those criteria aren't met. So there are these ambiguous areas. For example, if you're dealing with a building like this doesn't meet that risk criteria, so what is the appropriate level of response? Well, it's up to the authority of having jurisdiction to determine that. And for the most part, fire departments across Canada have been just responding with everything they have to the best of their ability, calling in mutual aid and auto aid from their neighboring communities, and they just do the best they can. And none of these things were really quantified, and there wasn't a lot of evidence used around the decision-making process. But that's changing. And you guys need to be aware that you should be on the front lines of using actual quantifiables, using measurables to make your decisions around fire protection. I won't go into too much detail of this table because this is essentially getting deep into the weeds. But just like I was saying, NFPA 1720 has a set of standards of response. This is the set of standards of response that the insurers use, that we use to measure you. And essentially what it is for each horizontal row that you see, it is a required fire flow that we would assign to a zone, just like we showed you the fire flow demand zones. And once we've assigned that zone, then there is a specific amount of fire department apparatus, firefighters, hoses, master streams, elevated streams like we see on aerial devices that we measure you against having. Which is not to say that you have to have them. It's not a binary. We're not saying, for example, you need to have 4 pieces of apparatus in 3.5 minutes. So if you don't have that, you get 0 credit. That's not how the system works. We measure the credit in terms of a 0 to 100% scale. So if, for example, you're being measured against providing 4 apparatus in 3.5 minutes, and you can only provide 4 apparatus in 6.5 minutes, we would measure you on a 0 to 100% scale and say, in this case, they're getting 70% credit. Because they can get that amount of equipment there, but it takes them longer to get it there. And that affects your overall fire insurance grade. The other key piece that we measure is the distribution. And this is one of the most difficult things to describe, but what I can tell you is that for every one of the points you saw in the required fire flow assessment, we do this analysis where our GIS algorithm measures how far is it from the first responding fire station, how far from the second, how far from the third, how far from the fourth, how far from the fifth, and what sort of resources do we have from each one of those. Do we get one piece of apparatus or one company? Do we get two pieces of apparatus? Do we get a pumper or ladder? The main companies that we measure, we're not as keen in on rescue apparatus. We are primarily measuring how effectively you can fight fires. So we're really interested in your pumper apparatus, your aerial apparatus or your ladder equipment, and your mobile water supplies, and your initial attacks. Those are the main four that we're going to be measuring. Do you have them? Where are they positioned in your community? And where you put them will directly impact the fire insurance grades. It has a huge impact. So be aware that it's not always wise to just put your fire station on the least valuable piece of property, even if it's 20 kilometers out of town. You really want to position the fire station so it gets the maximum coverage in terms of road distance, and we measure that with a GIS algorithm. Water supplies, same sort of thing that we measure in terms of fire departments. We look at every element of your water supply system. Do you have enough water? Do you have pipes that are big enough? Pumps that are big enough? All of the things that we would consider from source to the actual point where you're going to be delivering it. And the biggest issues that we see, well, I shouldn't say the biggest. Some of the issues that we commonly see are inadequate reservoir storage. So essentially, people read our document, Water Supply for Public Fire Protection. At some point in the document, they say the absolute minimum to be recognized is one hose stream, 200 gallons per minute for 2 hours, 120 minutes. What does that mean to me as a designer? 200 times 120, 24,000 gallons. That's how big I'll make my reservoir. That often ends up not being recognized or not credited because essentially you haven't taken into account all the other things that you need to, such as domestic demand. Some of your required fire flows are higher than 200 gallons per minute, and as such, you can end up with, you've spent millions of dollars in your water supply infrastructure, and it's not helping you to get reduced insurance costs because we don't recognize it, because it was under-designed. It was poorly designed, or it was designed only for domestic use, and they just threw a few hydrants on hoping that insurers would be fooled. And I can tell you, for the last 50 years, a lot of insurers have been fooled by that. A lot of insurers were just using the system where they would say, property ABC, they'd ask the property owner, do you have a hydrant within 300 meters? And do you have a fire hall within 8 kilometers? And if you said yes and yes, boom, you get protected rates. Well, as I'm going to show you guys, more and more of the insurers are realizing that there's a lot of mistakes made using that system. And so they're actually directly plugging into the digital system, which gives them a much more solid answer. And what ends up happening is that some of these hydrants, if it's not recognized, you don't qualify for those lower insurance rates. And then what happens is that the property insurer changes the rates accordingly. The property owner finds out his rates just doubled or tripled. And then he comes to you, the local government, and says, what's going on? You guys have mismanaged this water system or this fire department, and I don't qualify for these rates anymore. It ends up back on my desk, and they often say, well, you guys must have changed your system. And I usually end up saying, no, we haven't changed anything, actually. We've just made it more accurate and more accessible. So as we made it more accurate and more accessible, insurers are using it properly, they're getting the right answer, and it turns out that a lot of these properties in Canada should have never gotten protected rates. They should have, for the last 20 years, been paying double or triple. And if they had been, they probably would have been knocking on your door and saying, we need investment in fire protection. And you probably could have made different decisions about the level of fire protection that you provided. When we come out to your communities and measure the water supplies for fire protection, we look at the hydrants and their installation, maintenance, any kind of rules that you have around that. We look at your flow testing schedule. We've seen a huge discrepancy in terms of how well communities are flow testing their hydrants. And remember, there's a big difference between flow testing and flushing. Flushing, you open up your hydrant, you let it run, the sediment comes out, you turn off the hydrant, good to go. Flow testing actually is something totally different. You have to set up gauges on multiple hydrants and then open up 1 or 2 hydrants or even more to measure the capacity to flow throughout a section of the system. And it should be done at least every 5 years, but I found lots of communities aren't aware of that, and they aren't doing any flow testing. In fact, we had one in Coquitlam in British Columbia just last week, where we went into a section of the system, and the pipes were so just full of, they just had never been, they weren't being flushed, I don't think even. And essentially when we were opening up the hydrants, you couldn't get one hose stream out of them. You literally could not get 10 gallons per minute out of them. It was a trickle coming out of these hydrants. We've been in hydrants, or in communities where hydrants aren't properly maintained, and it's like they're welded shut. After a while, though, if they're not properly maintained and exercised and greased, they just weld themselves shut. And then when the fire department arrives, they can't operate these hydrants. In particular, with private hydrants. In your communities, I'm sure there are some properties where you have, through your bylaws, required them to have some private hydrants on their property, in their design. Maybe a large strata development, maybe a large shopping mall, large institutions. A lot of times there isn't a way to get the easements in, so you require them to put in some private hydrants. Well, what are your requirements around private hydrant maintenance and installation and flow testing? And are you actually following up on that and making sure that these things are being done? Because when we come in and evaluate you, what we do, and in the Fire Insurance Grading Index, you'll see when I show you the results, when a property gets searched, if it shows private hydrants, a big disclaimer pops up for the insurer saying, Fire Underwriter Survey doesn't evaluate private fire hydrants because there's no way that we could. In a city the size of Regina, there might be 1,000 or 1,500 private hydrants, all with separate private owners. So every one of those private hydrants, we tell the insurer, you need to set up a warranty to make sure that that property is maintaining the hydrant. Most insurers haven't gone to that length to do that, and so they just treat it as unprotected. They just say, we're going to consider that hydrant doesn't count. Because we don't know if the municipality is doing anything. And my experience has been most municipalities are hands off with private hydrants. They don't want the liability. We encourage municipalities to take over the maintenance of private hydrants, to require that, to essentially tell every private owner, we don't trust you, we know that we like you in our community and what have you, but when it comes to maintaining emergency equipment that's going to determine whether or not people live or die, whether or not we save property, we want to be responsible, and we want to actually maintain those private hydrants. And when communities take over the maintenance of the private hydrants, even if they don't own them, we actually flip a switch in our system, and those private hydrants then are shown to the insurers exactly as we would show public hydrants. So be aware. Fire safety control, I'll just quickly touch on. This is, like we mentioned earlier, how well do you implement your building codes, your fire codes? I did a similar presentation for the fire protection engineers a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking to a bunch of the engineers from different municipalities, and I said, how many of you have a certified fire plans examiner in your office that's making sure every one of these buildings, Part 3 buildings that you're allowing to be built, is actually properly sprinkler protected? And I didn't get a single yes. Not one community represented by the engineers actually had someone that was appropriately certified checking the plans. They're 100% reliant on the engineer stamps. And most of you guys probably haven't been involved in this, but I can tell you I have. I used to check engineers' drawings and engineers' hydraulic calculations, and I found tons of discrepancies, tons of mistakes. There's lots of civil engineers and mechanical engineers out there checking fire sprinkler drawings. There is a standard, NFPA 13, it's as big as the building code, that you have to design sprinkler systems to. And most of these engineers that are signing off on them, they don't even have access to that document. They're signing off on it, assuming that whoever it was that was the designer or the technician, hopefully they did due diligence and they actually had access to the document. So be aware that when we come in and look at you guys, we're going to be looking at you from a due diligence perspective. If you're responsible for designing a building to the building code, and I come in and say, let's see your copy of the building code, let's see your checklist, and you say, I don't have a copy of the building code. Well, how are you checking the building to make sure it actually adheres to the building code and it's compliant? And that's the kind of thing that we're doing. Now, that being said, we're not in the business of scolding people. We're just measuring you on a scale of 0 to 100% credit and saying, those communities that are doing due diligence and properly documenting that, it's very easy. We just give 100% credit. In terms of the firefighting assumptions of the building code, those of you guys, I believe that you guys use the National Building Code in Saskatchewan and you don't modify it. So are you aware, those of you that are involved in making decisions around firefighting and around municipal government, that the National Building Code in, I think it's Appendix B, has a whole chapter, a whole section on assumptions of the building code. And those assumptions go on to describe what the firefighting expectations are for municipalities. And I've sort of summarized or pulled out a couple of the sentences, and I really want this one. If you ignore everything else I've said today, that's fine. You're well within your rights to do so. But please take one moment. Everybody involved in municipal government in Canada that has any decision-making authority over fire protection should be familiar with this section of the building code from the appendix. So essentially what this clause is saying is that the onus lies with you, those who are deciding what you allow to be built in a municipality. The onus lies with you to control what you allow to be built to that which you can reasonably protect. So when I've gone into communities, I often bring this clause forward, and I'm always surprised that most people aren't aware of it. Essentially, if you're controlling what you allow to be built in a community, and right now in BC, it's gangbusters with the 6-story combustible. Communities are allowing these to be built, not taking into consideration whether or not they can protect them. And that's a big problem. And I can tell you that it's going to create some liability scenarios. The communities are going to get caught, and it's not going to be good for them. Because when you allow something to be built, and you're the person that's also deciding how much fire protection to provide, what sort of equipment you need to have, are you putting the two together? If you allow very high-risk buildings to be built, are you saying to the developer at the outset, we need this, we need to put a fire station in the middle of this, we need to do this, we need to do that, we need to consider how that risk is going to affect our whole community for the next 100 years? Because essentially, when you drop a risk like this, and I go back to that gravitational field theory, I don't know if that resonates with you guys, but you are basically dropping, if you think of that fabric of your community on a map, and we have all those required fire flow points, when you have a big risk, you build something big, especially something that's combustible, that's going to burn. It's like dropping a 600-pound bowling ball in the middle of that fabric, and it's pulling all the fire protection towards that. And it will affect the fire insurance grades not only for that property, but for the entire community, because we're measuring your community's ability to handle all the risks that you've allowed to be built. So when you build big risks, the question is, are you also adding in appropriate levels of fire protection? So it's fine to build big risks. It's no different than if you think of a brake system on a big truck. You want to, carry around 50 tons of stored materials in your truck. It's fine, but you need to have a braking system that can stop 50 tons. It's the same with your community. If you're going to build big risks, you need to consider how well are we going to be able to protect against these big risks. I won't get into e-comm because I doubt if many people here have much of a focus on emergency communications, but be aware that that's one of the other things. It's 10% of the grading that we do measure, and we are looking at how you've set up your system, what sort of a paging system that you have, what sort of a call center that you have, and how effective that whole system works. This section goes fairly deep into the weeds, and I'll just kind of summarize and gloss over it because we do want to wrap this up fairly quick. Each sub area that we've measured, so for example, for this building, we said 2,000 gallons per minute. We've measured your ability to produce the number of firefighters, the number of pumpers, the number of hose streams. All of those things are measured, and essentially each one of them, we assign a 0 to 100% score. We aggregate those into those 4 areas: fire department, water supply, e-comm, and fire safety control. And then we put those 4 together into one classification to come up with your final PFPC. For communities that have been graded in the last 6 years since we developed the digital representation of the system, you have access to your grade sheets, which show how much credit you've got in blue, how much credit is available to you in each sub area of the grading here in red. And it also shows the weighting, because some areas are more important than others. For example, available fire force is the most heavily weighted. When we've grouped that was, I think, the 19 categories of fire department on the previous slide. When we group all that together into one, you can see on the left column, that is the 19 areas, sub areas of the fire department grouped into one. And this is those 4 areas: fire department, water supply, e-comm, and fire safety control. When we say each one of the areas is a 0 to 10 or 1 to 10 relative class, or the final PFPC is a 1 to 10 relative class, you could directly think of that in terms of the percentages. So if you've got 0 to 10% credit, it's a class 10. If you've got 10 to 20% credit, it's a class 9. 20 to 30% credit, it's a class 8. If you've got 90 to 100% credit, it's a class 1. And those classifications, when we've aggregated all that information together, essentially drive the insurer's line capacities. So if you're an insurance company and you are interested in insuring in Canada, you incorporate all this information into your business model, and you set your line capacities accordingly to the protection. And recently we've been undertaking a bunch of actuarial studies. Some of them are strongly indicative that it's not only a good predictor of fire loss severity, it's also a good predictor of other types of perils and the severity of losses. And we believe that it has to do with the PFBC is a pretty strong indicator of how well governed a community is. This is the DPG system. I'm just gonna quickly gloss over how we work in the DPG system. It was originally a 1 to 5 class system. Class 1 represents career, class 2 composite levels of fire department. 3 was originally volunteer, and it's still volunteer, but now 3 is split into A and B. So it's volunteer with hydrants and volunteer with a shuttle. So that's 3A and 3B. Class 4 is typically a fire department that has some significant deficiencies, and as such, we recommend insurers treat it as unprotected. Some insurers might give it some limited recognition. The basic requirements for the DPG system, because it's very simplified, are all covered in our website. You can visit thefireunderwriters.ca, click on dwelling protection grade, and it says what the specific prescriptive requirements are for each one. I'm just going to jump to a new one because you guys haven't seen this in Saskatchewan yet, but it's fairly popular in Ontario, and it's recently become popular in BC. It's something that we have split out the 3B grade into 2 separate categories as well, and one of them is 3BS or STSS. And that stands for Superior Tanker Shuttle Service, and it's an accreditation process where fire departments, which you typically would use 3 to 5 tankers or mobile water supply apparatus in conjunction with their normal system, can deliver the minimum or more than the minimum that's required for hydrant systems in areas that don't have hydrant protection. That's a mouthful. I want to just hang on this one for just a second, because again, this is probably pretty important. For anybody that has an area that has some properties that don't currently receive hydrant protection, it's something that you should be kind of thinking about, because hydrant protection versus non-hydrant protection has a huge impact on the property insurance rates. And so if you can get this 3BS accreditation for a fire department to deliver the Superior Shuttle Service, it can have a pretty dramatic impact on property insurance, and it can be done fairly cost effectively. We've seen a number of communities do it where the difference is to the tune of millions of dollars in property insurance. What do we do with all this information, and what's the system that we've been building? We've talked about the digitization of the grading index. So like I say, this was all published in a book that you can imagine. I mean, people that were living 50 kilometers outside of Regina, when they wrote their mailing address, they would just use Regina as their mailing address, even though they aren't in Regina and they don't get fire protection from Regina. Well, a lot of insurers were giving them the appropriate fire insurance grades for Regina because the insured said, my house is in Regina. And so that created a lot of the problems with the current system that we have, and the digital GIS system that we've created really solves that. And what we do is we layer in a bunch of information, and I'll quickly kind of go through a few slides to show you what we essentially do, what information we aggregate to come up with the final fire insurance grade. But you can think of it like layers, and that's what we show this slide for. Is essentially one layer is the municipal boundaries or the fire protection service boundaries, one layer is fire halls, one layer is hydrants. And this is the fire halls layer, so this is what the fire halls that we've mapped right across Canada. This is the municipal boundaries layer, and essentially one of the things that we've created recently to allow communities like yourselves to A, better understand what fire insurance grades apply in your community, and B, to help you to self-report on your fire protection. We've created a new tool called the Municipal Portal, which initially we've created, you can let your fire chief know to contact us. We've created an account for every fire chief in Canada to be able to log in and see their information, the information that we have about them. And we really are in this first iteration trying to ensure that the fire chiefs are clearing up what sort of contracts, mutual aid, and auto aid agreements do they have. So in this area, we want to make sure that we get that information right, and we want to know where that applies. So for this community, are they protecting the area outside of their community, or do they essentially cut off protection at their boundary? And in the past, we know that fire departments were pretty good about just responding wherever there was a fire, regardless of boundaries. We're seen that go by the wayside in most provinces. Essentially, communities are realizing, and this is never more true than in the case of the City of Calgary. City of Calgary was protecting Rocky View, that was the surrounding municipal district, for years. There's this handshake mutual aid agreement. You know, if you need something, give us a call. We'll come out and respond to you guys. So this is pretty much how fire protection worked from the get-go in Canada. But at a certain point, the City of Calgary brought their own fiscal economist in and said, you know, let's do an analysis of where we can save some money. And one of the first things they identified was these responses into Rocky View, they're costing you $2.5–3 million a year. So what's Rocky View paying you back for those responses? And the City of Calgary said nothing. So he literally, I mean, overnight their policy changed and they said, from now on, we want to have a more formal agreement with our neighbor where they'll pay for those responses. So it's fine, we'll still respond to you, but we're going to charge an appropriate rate. So essentially our taxpayers aren't paying for your protection. And more communities across Canada are coming to that conclusion that it's appropriate to have mutual and auto aid where there is a equitable sharing of resources. But where the sharing of resources is lopsided, then it's maybe more appropriate that there be some sort of a contract and there be some reimbursement to equalize the level of service and essentially pay the people that are providing the service. So we want to make sure that we get that information right, because every time somebody searches, and the insurers search the grading index all the time, they want to get the right fire protection provider. So if we're talking about an area just outside, let's say to the north, there's an address right there that's the insurer is going to underwrite. They want to know, is their property protection and fire department coming from Regina, or is it going to be coming from maybe another service provider in one of these other areas? Maybe up north, or maybe this is the fire hall probably associated with that municipal county or rural municipality. So essentially, is the fire protection going to be coming from this fire hall over here all the way into here, or is it going to be somebody from Regina? And that question could make a difference. It could be huge. That question could determine whether or not a development happens. Because it could be thousands of dollars for a small property. It could be tens of thousands of dollars. It could be hundreds of thousands of dollars of difference, depending on who's going to provide the fire protection. So be aware that we want to get that information right, and we've created a portal that you can let your fire chief know. He could contact me this afternoon. I'll give him his username and password. He can log in and start, number one, making sure that we've got the right information in here about you, and number two, being able to give you information to help you make educated choices about policy and how much fire protection you want to provide. The next layer we add in is the hydrants. So if we don't have hydrant data for your community, over the last 100 years, we've probably visited you and done some hydrant flow testing and assigned a class to your water system, but we might not have the hydrant information in GIS format. So if you have it in GIS format, please provide it to us. We'll make sure that the people, the property owners that deserve the thousands or tens of thousands of dollars of discounts associated with hydrant protection, that they're getting it. And if you don't have the hydrants in a GIS format, then get it to us in whatever format that you have. We'll convert it into GIS and give it back to you for free. We have no problem with that. So if you have like a hard copy of a map, and we literally do this, we say put the map on the wall, take a picture of it, send it over to us. Our GIS team will geo-reference, whatever key points are on the map and get those hydrants loaded into our system. For hydrants, we typically want to get a bunch of information about them, and eventually we'll include them in the municipal portal, but for the time being, the hydrant data is stored separately in the grading index. But we do keep a bunch of information about the hydrants, and there are a few main characteristics, whether or not it's recognized or not recognized, and that's at the system level. So essentially, a badly designed system or a system that has poor maintenance, we might just flip a switch and say, not recognized. And if it's a part of a not recognized water system, when insurers search, it'll show the hydrant, but it'll be black, and essentially it'll say, this is not a recognized hydrant system. What we want to happen in that case is the insurer tells the broker, sorry, we can't give you hydrant protected rates. We know you sent us a picture of the hydrant, we can't give you hydrant protected rates, it's not part of a recognized system. The broker tells the insured, sorry, you don't qualify for hydrant protected rates. Yes, that means you got to pay double what you used to pay. We know you used to pay $1,000 a year. From now on, it's going to be $2,000 a year. We won't back charge you for all the previous years we did it incorrectly, but that hydrant system should have never been recognized. The insured, furious at that point, comes to you the municipal council and says, what's going on? Why is this water system not recognized? You contact your water engineer or contact our offices directly and says, what's going on? How come this water system's not recognized? We say water systems have to be designed for fire protection. They need appropriate maintenance. These are the minimum criteria that you need to meet. This is where you haven't met that criteria. Provide us with your plan of how you're going to meet that criteria, and we'll flip the switch and you'll be back to recognized in no time. Typically, it's a process that can take 3 months to 3 years. We run an algorithm on all that data in those layers, and we create what we call the fire insurance grade maps. And like I say, these have been created for every community in Canada. When the insurers are searching for an address, essentially it's referencing one of these maps and saying, which one of the polygons does it exist in? This blue area, that's an area that would actually qualify for, I think it's PFBC 3. The orange area, it's PFBC 9. The red area is PFBC 10. This has a huge impact on property insurance rates and line capacities. So essentially, where your property falls in here is going to really determine what sort of property insurance rates the property owner pays. And you, as the person or as the group that are responsible for designing the system, just need to be aware that those decisions that you make determine whether or not that's going to be a PFBC 3 applied to the blue area or a PFBC 8. When the insurers type in an address, and our system was built initially to support a website, so essentially we went from handing out books to insurers and they would look up Regina and see, oh, it's a PFBC 3. Instead of that, now they would essentially look up the address, and it's much more accurate, because even within Regina, you could see, or Saskatoon, you could see there's more than one grade that applies depending on how far you are from a hydrant or from a fire hall. So the insurers now see this screen that gives them a detailed breakdown of the fire protection characteristics. As well as below that on the screen, it shows this map, and it shows which fire hall responds first, and we're actually going to be expanding that this year to show not only the first responding fire hall, but the first 3 responding fire halls, including those that would be covered under mutual aid and auto aid and contract protection. So essentially, you guys getting us that information makes sure that this information is portrayed to the insurers accurately, and that the property owners that you represent are getting the appropriate insurance rates for the level of protection. I like to say connecting the dots. Most communities in Canada are made up of mostly dwellings. When we do the cost-benefit analysis, we do this sometimes for communities, we'll do a quick rundown of how much assessed value exists across a community. And what we typically find is that about 80 to 90%, sometimes more or less, is dwellings and personal lines insured properties. Only about 10%, 15% would be commercial lines insured properties, which is everything else. In a sample community of 30,000, we actually have done these for many different size communities, but I like this one because it's kind of in the middle. A sample community of about 30,000 population, it had 14,000 dwellings. We showed that across the community, across those 14,000 dwellings, the cost of fire protection services they were paying was $22 million a year, and they were using a quasi NFPA 1710 model. So they had 4 career firefighters on duty that would be responding across their community 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That involved them having 25 or 26 firefighters, training officer, prevention officer, and chief. So they had a fairly expensive model, a robust model of fire protection. It cost them about $22 million a year. The average house we established was about $450,000 real estate price, where the average building and contents value was $250,000. So that would be the insurable price. The insurance to value is $250 grand. We determined that with no fire protection, that average house would be receiving a premium of about $3,300, $3,290 a year. And with the level of fire protection they were getting, the career level of service, DPG1, full hydrant protection, that dropped the property insurance for a typical dwelling down to $893 a year. Across the 14,000 dwellings, that difference of $2,400 added up to about $33.5 million a year. So that's a pretty substantial difference. And this is essentially why the insurers built this system. The insurers used to provide their own fire protection. Back over 100 years ago, when the municipalities first started providing public fire protection, the amount of fire protection they provided was absolutely inadequate. So the insurers used to kind of beef it up and provide their own fire brigades, and or hire, there would be fire brigades that would just kind of roam the streets. I think if you guys have probably seen the Gangs of New York, in one of the initial scenes, 2 gangs kind of come together in front of a burning building and start fighting to see who's going to fight the fire. And that's because these, street gangs would literally try to put out fires and get a reward for actually successfully saving property for an insurer. So this was a kind of haphazard model of a fire protection that we used to have in Canada and in the United States. And we've really solved that with the Fire Insurance Grading Index because it creates this incentive. If you're running a municipality and you're deciding whether or not to spend on fire protection, and you know that spending on fire protection is going to have a significant cost benefit to the property insurance, that's something that you can essentially, hang your hat on and say to your insureds, there's a reason that we're spending this money and that we're charging you this level of taxes. There's a reason for this, and it has to do with how much you're going to be paying for your insurance. We have approached the insurance community to say, could you be a little more transparent about how you give the discounts? Like, for example, I don't know how it works in Saskatchewan with motor vehicle, but I'm from BC, and they show me on my insurance, I get a 40% safe driver discount. So we wish that they would show that discount that they associate with fire protection, and they have said they don't necessarily want to do that. Insurers have indicated, they really would do that only if all of the insurers could come to the table again and agree on how they would do it, and it may not ever happen. But you, as the people making the decisions, need to be aware of that. You can speak to your local brokers. The brokers may not have enough knowledge to really understand. We haven't made the system available to brokers in the past. For over 100 years, brokers didn't even know this existed. A broker would take the information from the insured, take that to the underwriter and say, what sort of a premium would you charge? They take that to 5 different underwriters and find out what the prices would be, take that back to the insured. It was the underwriters who had access to this information. So the brokers may not know. So you may actually need to go one level beyond the brokers. But we strongly encourage that, go to the underwriters, find out what sort of difference would you be paying without any fire protection. Get rid of your fire department, get rid of your water supply system, and find out just what sort of a difference any given property in your community would be paying. And then you can do the math. You have the assessed values. You can do the math and find out what sort of a cost benefit specifically is available in your community. On the PFPC side, we also do these kinds of calculations, but because there's so much less property in terms of the overall values of the property, like we were saying, 85% of the property assessed values are dwellings, only 15% is commercial. It tends to be less significant in terms of the actual, what you see, the visible cost benefit. And here we see the cost benefit in this community was about $6 billion worth of commercial lines insured property. The cost savings for their fire protection programs was around $3.2 million. Now, that being said, there are other things that a person should take into consideration when you consider, the value of it beyond in terms of the actual cost benefit. Because essentially, you're also getting the saved lives and property, the business continuity, and the maintenance of a tax base. And don't undervalue those. The business continuity factor for small communities that might only have 1 or 2 major businesses or major companies or major employers, if that employer burns to the ground, what sort of an economic impact would that have on your community? If everybody in your community that was employed at that, mill or whatever it happened to be, or a manufacturer, if all of that was wiped out in one fire, and all those taxpayers stop paying tax tomorrow because now they're unemployed, how is that going to affect the municipality? How soon are those people going to start moving out and going to other municipalities where they can find work? And how is that going to affect your economy? So the insurance community really stabilizes the financial aspects, not only by getting those businesses back on their feet fairly quickly, but also by actually encouraging the community to mitigate the risk to prevent the severe losses. I did want to mention, though, the impact of the insurance model that we have here in Canada and globally is really profound. And sometimes people think of insurance as being this negative thing, I have to pay, but they don't realize how much benefit they derive from it, not just themselves, but as a society. And what we show, Munich Re created these charts that show areas of the world that are really well insured versus those that aren't well insured. And as you would expect, modern G7, G8 countries are fairly well insured, and these are the light blue on the map. Those communities actually experience the greatest cat losses. When we look at this, we can see that 37% of the natural catastrophes between 1980 and 2009 occurred in those countries. They experienced large financial losses as a result, but when we look at the chart on the right, we can see that actually they received the fewest number of fatalities. And you could think of this as representing personal injury as well. Why is that? It's because they're the best protected. The communities that are well insured, the areas of the world that are well insured, actually invest in mitigation and do the right thing and make sure that they're doing things to try to limit their loss exposure. And those of you involved in the SUMA Sure program that are part of a reciprocal, you have a vested interest, especially if you're in a reciprocal, to try to reduce your losses. Because essentially, as part of a reciprocal, if your losses are higher, you'll be paying more insurance next year. So I think that I'll leave it here. I'll open up the floor to a couple of questions. We only have time for a couple of minutes here because the next presentation is going to start. I went a little long. I apologize for that. But if anybody does have any questions and we don't have time to get to them today, feel free to email me. You can check the website, fireunderwriters.ca, admin@fireunderwriters.ca. It'll end up on my desk at some point. If you have other questions about how fire insurance grades work and how it affects your community, what sort of information you need to know, if you want to get access to the portal for your fire chief, drop us a note. We really look forward to hearing from you. Any questions? If so, please come up to the microphone. Okay. Thanks very much, guys, and we'll see you again soon.